Thomas and Frederick. With Thomas and Frederick. With Thomas and Frederick.
Good morrow to you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcometh to State of the Franchise, the podcast beyond discusses franchise as well as shapes, sizes, backgrounds, genres, and types. I am one of thy hosts, Sir Thomas Stadler of Mech1, hither with mine fellow host and thy director for this evening, Mr. Frederick Dakin III. Valorous day, Fred, how art thee?
Two podcasters, both alike in infamy, in Bayview where we lay our scene. Welcome to State of the Franchise, where from forth the fatal loins of these two bros, a podcast takes flight. Welcome to State of the Franchise. I'm Fred, and that was Tom.
I love that we both each had our own bit that we clearly designed right.
I wasn't not going to do mine, okay, Tom? You did yours, and that was cool, but I was like, I'm getting in there, too.
No, you got to. I mean, Fred, it was the perfect table setter. Obviously, we're both feeling the vibes today because we're talking about Mr. Willie Shakes himself, Sir William Shakespeare. He is a sir, right? I don't even know if I've ever looked that up.
No.
I don't know if he's been knighted.
He's not.
No.
Wow.
Yeah. Being knighted for things like your contributions to the arts is most likely not something they would have done back then, and probably would not have done for a theater actor. Remember, a lot of times the people in charge back then tried to shut the theaters down, because the idea that theater is high art is not necessarily something that all ruling classes have agreed on over time. And I would imagine that some of our current rulers, based on how they give absolutely zero money to the arts, would be of that mind as well. But so no, it is not Sir William.
Man, they were just, not woke back in the late 16th century, clearly. Well, Fred, I think without having to present too much, we are talking about the adaptations of William Shakespeare today, and you already heard one of our special guests today. We have two guests on with us today. One is Miss Beth Ann, and one Mr. Patrick Schmitz. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
And welcome back, Beth.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be back with you.
Yeah.
Excited to be here.
Yes, I understand Shakespeare is in the air right now with both of you in your personal lives.
Yes, we are currently rehearsing for a parody that I wrote called The Comedy of King Lear, Kinda Sorta, which is the fifth one that I've written now. So that'll be going up August 10th through the 12th.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, so 5 of those already. So, but is that the 5th adaptation, not of Shakespeare, right? Just of a play?
5th of Shakespeare shows, and then I did 2 others
really?
that were, one was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer parody, and then Dracula parody as well. So 7 parodies. Wow. Like, well, Tom Sawyer. I guess we're talking 8. Never mind. 8 parodies that I've written. Yeah.
Wow. And Beth, were you involved in all those Shakespeare productions too?
I was in every single one of the things he just said.
Holy cow!
Yeah.
Yes. Because the Tom Sawyer one was a radio show, and I know that there were 2 versions of that, but when it actually went out on the radio, I don't think it was in the stage version, but I was in the radio version that went out.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So, yes. So, no, I've been in, I often tease Patrick because I've been in all of his shows except one. And we just had to get that out of the way right here at the top.
Yep. It was play number 2, and I thought, well, I'll kind of go all over the place with my casting. And then I realized it wasn't the same without Beth, and I never made that mistake again.
But yeah, no, he's not allowed to do these without me, I think.
Yeah, at this point.
Of course, he can certainly make any choices he wants to make about his own, but I would be crestfallen and heart crushed, and if I was not involved. But yeah, so I've been in all those. Love a Schmitz parody.
Yeah,
they're fun to write.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and to be in.
Yeah,
and to see.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to seeing the
and to sponsor.
And the sponsor.
Are you trying to get this podcast to sponsor? We can sponsor.
I do or do not. There is no. Oh yeah. Well, let's talk after the interview. Absolutely.
We'll have our little logo in the program, Fred. We have to get on that pretty quick then.
Right.
But it's clear then that you both are very well steeped in Shakespeare adaptations. So it's great to have you both on to talk about this, because I think when we talk about William Shakespeare, I mean, there isn't a lot to be said that hasn't already really been said over what I just said, almost 500 years worth of, discussions around his plays. I mean, more accurately 400, but still. It's the mere fact that this has been shows and a medium that has been constantly produced, reproduced, readapted in so many different ways that there's a lot to discuss. But I guess what I'm very curious though about, to go talk to everybody here, is maybe where you first got involved with the playwright William Shakespeare, whether it was a school assignment or otherwise.
Well, I will say when, obviously high school is when most people are introduced to it. And at that point, I just mentally and maturity level wise, I was just not ready for it. I didn't understand it. When I started working at First Stage, Shakespeare was all around me. Everybody loved Shakespeare, and I felt like I was the odd man out a lot of times. And I would watch it, and a lot of times I wouldn't understand it, but I would watch it, and I would see everybody around me love this thing. And it kind of hit me. I'm like, this is much like understanding why Citizen Kane is such a great film. Like, you have to study this in order to appreciate it.
Sure.
It's rare that you can just sit and fully appreciate why people love this work so much unless you do the homework on it. And so then becoming a theater teacher, I'm like, I got to know Shakespeare more than I do. So as I was doing the homework on that, as I became a theater teacher, I started to realize and understand just how great this work was. And fortunately, came the bits in my head constantly as I'm reading, like Hamlet, for example. And I'm like, oh, it'd be funny if, but no, I gotta know the real thing for my students. It's all about the students. So, that was kind of my love for it. Doing the homework and talking to people about it, watching different versions, either online or live, and going back to my teachers and friends at First Stage and just picking their brains apart as to why the love for the work. And the number one answer I remember hearing was because Shakespeare, of all the playwrights that my boss had experienced, was Shakespeare was like the strongest playwright who actually understood what it meant to be a human being and actually dissected that and went into that and showed that. And so that's my Shakespeare intro.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty interesting, though, too, to think about, with the idea of him kind of being more of somebody who understands the humanity of it. Because I think one of the hardest things, I speak more from a film study in this regard, but is that writing dialogue that sounds like real people would say it is one of the most difficult things. And I think it's an overappreciated or underappreciated aspect of what screenwriters can do. Talking about screenwriters getting paid and why they should get paid, it's because, a robot's not going to be able to capture that emotion or that feeling and understanding how somebody acts and lives. And you really get a sense of who these people are, even for the time that it was written. And it's impressive to see it just kind of persevere all this time onward now.
Yeah.
What about you, Beth?
So I also was, introduced to it in grades. It would have been grade school for me. I had a really amazing 8th grade teacher, Miss J, who would, how to put this? So we were going to see Hamlet in person. And she did this great thing she said, well, so what we're going to do before we go see it is we're going to learn what's happening. And it wasn't like we're going to read it and we're going to just go home, read Hamlet, and that's it. We interacted with Hamlet. So she would give us like scenes to work, like to break down. And we would see, clips of movies, or she'd read it aloud to us in the way. That's the thing that I think often happens is, unfortunately, teachers don't have enough time and they don't have enough resources, so they have to get through the Shakespeare thing, and it's hard to make it come alive sometimes. So it's like, go home and read this. It's written in a language that's almost not a language we speak anymore.
Yeah.
And you have to read the footnotes to get the jokes. And this was something that wasn't meant to be read in the hand. It was meant to be listened to while it was performed or performed out loud. So she made sure that we did that we performed it a little bit, or that we listened to it said, that we saw things of it performing. So we went into the local high school's version of Hamlet knowing what the story was, right, and understanding it.
Mhm.
And I remember thinking that there were probably a lot of other kids in that room who were like, what is happening? Because it hadn't been, introduced to them really. And so from there, it was just like, oh, this is really fascinating. This is really obviously well written. These characters are really great. There's a lot going on here beyond what's on the page. So much of Hamlet is characters. Shakespeare was fantastic at irony. So it's a lot of characters not saying what they mean. And the interesting part comes from the fact that what they're saying is not matching how they feel, right? And trying to read through that. I think that's probably the first time that I was really introduced to that kind of writing, right? Where you couldn't trust anyone, or what they were saying had these twists on it. There's a great Shakespearean documentary called Looking for Richard, and one of the scholars in that says irony is just hypocrisy with style, and I think that's fantastic. And then so that was interesting. And then in high school, actually, I got really into Shakespeare because I didn't get cast in a part that I wanted in another play. So I got cast in a play, but I got cast in a very small part, and I was a little sad about that, as we are in high school. And a friend of mine who had kind of given up on even trying out for the high school plays was like, interestingly enough, Patrick was doing classes at First Stage. So my first really performing Shakespeare was as a student at First Stage, when I would have been maybe 15 or 16 years old. And the class we happened to take was a Shakespeare class. And it was just fantastic. It was really, it was the same kind of thing where we would break down the text and we talk about the themes behind it. And this particular one focused on the sonnets, which I thought was a really interesting thing to do as well. And then you could go home and you could memorize one and perform one. And I just remember it being like, okay, now I'm really hooked. And then college, I kept studying it. I actually took a class at the Globe in London, and I have performed on that stage as part of that class. So it's just been
that's amazing.
Yeah, so it's really something that I've been very, very fortunate, and it's something that sort of permeated my theater training since I was young. And it all started with, as so many things do, it all started with a really good teacher.
Good. You got to give it up for the teachers.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, and that's a credit to Patrick too, as somebody who, when he was young, wasn't maybe presented with it in a way that it fired him up. He found a way to make it interesting for him so that he could make it interesting for his students. And one of the things that's really fun about doing these parodies is that often like a former student will be in it, or there's young people, so like late teens, early 20s, who are taking part. And that's always one of my favorite things, is getting to work with the really like the people who are just coming out of that high school experience and enjoying Shakespeare in this other way. I think that's a really great thing to be a part of.
That's really amazing. I mean, it's cool that you and Patrick go back so far. So I guess you really both do have roots in this, even deeper than on the surface that I knew about.
Yeah.
But also, wow, amazing that you got to actually perform at the Globe Theater. Like, that's an experience not many people get.
Yeah,
right?
no, I was very, very lucky that as part of my undergraduate program, I took a class called Playing Shakespeare, and it ended in doing some sonnet work and doing, in my case, a scene from Love's Labour's Lost on that stage. So that was, it's just like, I love everything about my performance career, but that's always going to be hard to top. When I was like 22, and I was like, okay, well, we're just going to have to peak and then try to keep it going. But I will say, stood on, like the next act stage as Lady Macbeth for Patrick's thing and felt every bit as honored and blessed, if that's a word you want to say, or proud and happy about standing on that stage doing Patrick stuff as I felt that, because it just was, it's such a great thing to get to be a part of. Sorry. Anyway, go ahead. That's me.
Yeah, I think it's really cool though to be able to, I think, share in so many different experiences over time. Especially just going from something as big and like grandiose as that to, it's like, here's a great local production where you get to do, I mean, something that somebody has really never done before with how you've written the script, right? And like you get to do it in a totally different way. And I know Fred and I had the opportunity to see a show recently. I think we both went to the Dracula one together. I don't know, but Fred, what about you? Where did your Shakespeare journey begin? Do you recall?
Oh, Bill and I go way back. I remember on my first trip to England when I was 10 or 11. This is one of those trips where you go when you're too young and you don't really appreciate it. But I got to actually go to, was it Stratford upon Avon?
Whoa.
Something like that. And I got to see like his school, I believe. And I got to go to the Globe. I didn't see a show there, but I saw the outside of it. And when I went to high school, kind of similar to Beth, I did have a teacher who she kind of fed me a way that it's kind of a boring way to get into Shakespeare, but I do recommend it for people who are kind of struggling to connect with the languages. You get like the Cliff Notes or the books that have like the very basic text. It's kind of like a translation, but it's very simple to read. I feel if you can get through that, watch an adaptation of some sort that is using the language. So first you have like, I know what it's about. Then you get the visual language. And then by the third time, you can go see it on stage and just take it in because you know the story, you kind of know the character beats. And that's always been my approach because I do love it, but I can't watch it and just pick it up because I probably don't ingest it enough. I'm not with it enough. That's why I do like, with our topic today, we're talking about adaptations. I do like anything that can feed someone into the original version. And what's funny about Shakespeare is a lot of his stories are actually kind of even older stories. And he's just kind of like, I was talking to my brother who is an English teacher on the way home, and I was talking about Romeo and Juliet, and he was like, well, that's like a way old story. He just kind of did his version of it. And he adds his language, he adds his characters, and makes something that has lasted for a long time. And I just want to go back to that trip. I'm pretty sure he was kind of a little bit of a scoundrel. I'm pretty sure we saw him do like, I think he signed on a desk, like he like scribbled into a desk. And I don't know if that was like, this could have been him or if this was actually him. I just like the idea that he was causing trouble in school because I can relate to that.
That's very interesting. I was thinking like, oh, I wonder if it was based on Tristan and Isolde, but I think that wasn't exactly the fuel for that, and I'll lean on our some of our Shakespeare experts here to fact check me on that. Is it more about like a Romeo and Juliet type story?
Well, there's multiple inspirations, right? And then there's the actual Tristan and Isolde as well. So Tristan and Isolde is the one that's the one that most people say because it has very similar themes. Yes. So Tristan and Isolde is the same kind of thing where they're not allowed to be together and there's a misunderstanding and all that kind of stuff. But yes, so absolutely, Fred's right that a lot of the things that we think of Shakespeare came up with this story. That's not true. He even Macbeth is a story that comes from someplace else, right?
Wow. It's
the way that he told the story that made it interesting, right? And that's something that I think is interesting about parodying Shakespeare is that sometimes you get the people who don't want you to parody Shakespeare because it's sacrosanct, right? And that story should stand exactly how it is. And then there's purists who, if you're going to perform Shakespeare, you should never abridge it or you should never change anything and all that kind of stuff. And what's interesting about that is that, yes, so often Shakespeare himself was telling his version of a classic story.
Yeah.
But what makes that important is that the Shakespeare version is the version that comes through. And there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason that the Shakespeare version of that story is the version we all know. And it's not because he had a great publicist, right? It was popular, sure. So people go into the Globe and all that kind of stuff. And had a good troupe of actors around him. But the things that last for a reason. And I think that's something about Shakespeare's adaptations of the stories that had already existed. That's very interesting. But yes.
Yeah, it's just a whole element that I didn't really know about. So I'm glad you brought it up, Fred, and I'm glad you were able to expand on it, Beth, because it's such it feels so meta to even just be like, well, we're doing things about Shakespeare adaptations, but then it's really like, yeah, well, he also was an adapter himself. And I don't know, it's kind of twisted to think that people would be like, so like, oh, you can't do a parody of this. You can't do this. It's like, man, like one of my favorite childhood memories is watching Wishbone like do a Shakespeare play of The Tempest. Like,
yeah,
Fred and I were just talking about Wishbone earlier.
Yeah.
and those people terrified me. At least they did. I don't know if...
You know what? It might be controversial to say this. Those guys sound like bad hangs. Just gotta say.
I will say, I think so. Yes, sometimes there are people like, "How dare you? You don't have any right to do this," all that kind of stuff. And those people, maybe I don't want to spend an evening with them. But I also think that we're talking about Shakespeare in the ways that we love it, and I think to some people, when something is dear to them, they don't want somebody making fun of it in a way that is cruel or that is saying that it's bad, right? So I think there's a fine line between irreverent and disrespectful, right? So what the shows we're doing are, and what the best Shakespeare adaptations or parodies are to me, are ones that are not disrespectful of it. They may not have reverence for it in a sense of like, we cannot make any changes, or we cannot do any of those kind of stuff. But they're not disrespectful of it. And so that's something that I do tell people when I say I'm in a Shakespeare parody and they're like, oh, I'm a big fan of Shakespeare. It's like, no, it's not making fun of Shakespeare. It's making fun out of Shakespeare, which is very different, right?
Yep. I noticed that right away in the Romeo and Juliet film, which I started watching because I was like, oh, this will be interesting. And the first thing they do is the little gnome comes out and he starts with the prologue and he doesn't finish it because he's like, yeah, and then some other boring stuff is said. And I'm like, okay, well, you've just started off the show saying I don't like this stuff, but we're gonna parody it anyway. And I do have that fine line when writing, because I do respect those people, because like Beth said, there's a very deep place in their heart of why this is so special to them. And I want to show respect to those people as well as respecting the people who have no idea what the story's about. And I want them to be able to follow it as well.
Yeah, it derives from, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of what even parody means. And I think of nothing better than like all those stupid movies that came out in the early aughts of like Epic Movie or like Meet the Spartans or whatever that crap was. And I'd watch those and I felt dumber after I watched them, because I'm like, it's like you're misunderstanding what the idea is that you're trying to parody. Like, there's a reason Naked Gun makes sense and is funny versus what you're doing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mel Brooks, from I think is sort of for a lot of people, the gold standard of parodying certain genres, right? Like, two things I think have to be true, and this is coming out of one of the things that's coming out of something that Mel Brooks said, which is that, like, in order to parody something properly, you have to know it and love it more than the people who know it and love it more than anything else. You know what I mean? So, like, in order to do a good parody, you have to have love for the subject and knowledge of the subject that is beyond what even the most, like, people who love it the most. Like, this is their favorite. Westerns are my favorite kind of movie. Horror movies are my favorite kind of movie. Because that's the only way that you can get to something about that genre or story that people who love it will recognize and either be like, oh, that is true, that's something I recognize, that's familiar, that's funny, or suddenly realize about something that they've really liked that maybe they never had put directly in front of them before. You know what I mean? When you can get to something in a parody that's the essence of something, and you can make that subtext text in a way, you can really win over, I think, sometimes the people who really love that thing, because it's like, oh my gosh, you have so much knowledge of this and love for this that you've pulled out something that I myself didn't even notice, but that's really, really true, right? And so and so that's why I think the Mel Brooks movies are so good, and why, to your point, Tom, I actually had that written down in my notes to talk about today. Like, the reason those early aught parodies don't work is because they have neither love nor knowledge of those things. They could have written all of those. There might be a good one. I honestly don't know. But they could have watched the trailers for those movies and then written the parody of them. They're not saying anything new. They're just like, this is something that happens in those movies. Isn't it funny that this is like, no, we know that happens in the movie. Like, that's not interesting. You're not adding anything to this conversation or to our shared vernacular about it, right? But like I said, you get somebody who does parody really well, and you're going, oh yeah, you know what? I never really noticed that about it. Or I thought I was the only one who noticed that about it. Or that's my favorite thing about this thing that I love so much. And I'm so happy that somebody else on there found that. Or like, oh, you know what? That is the one thing I don't like about this thing that I like. And it's so funny that you've caught on that too. And we're playing gentle fun with it. So, yeah. So that's where I think about sort of good parody and loving parody versus not great.
I wouldn't say this is a good movie or a super funny one, but I think it's a movie that does that well. That's a Mel Brooks movie, is the Dracula Dead and Loving It, something that I've accidentally called the Dracula kind of sort of a few times by accident, because that was a movie I had on VHS. But I do remember in school when we read Dracula, going back and watching that, they were playing with the text in a way that was more interesting than just, like you said, like an epic movie where we're going to throw in a character, and he's going to say something dumb, and then that we're going to move on.
Yeah.
We're going to take like the book, take the characters, and find jokes within that. I think that's definitely the key to parody.
Yeah, those movies were like the culmination of like the Leo sitting on his couch pointing at the screen. Like, that's almost like what they are. It's just repeated jokes like that versus, like Dracula Dead and Loving It, Young Frankenstein are very like, clearly he loved watching these when he was younger and wanted to do something interesting with those properties. And I think Young Frankenstein done to a much better degree than Dracula, but still, this is not a Mel Brooks podcast. This is a Shakespeare podcast.
And parody has to have a point of view, and it has to say something new. It can't just be mimicry, because that's not parody. You know what I mean? That's just copying. It has to have its own. It has to have the point that it's making about it, right?
It needs to be wit.
Yeah, there has to be wit behind it. It has to get to an essence, but it has to decide something about what it's going to parody before it can do that. Whereas, like you said, I think some of those movies are just like, here's a line from that very popular film that came out. Isn't it funny that we're saying it in our movie? Like, no, that's not. You don't have a point of view. You're not giving me anything. So, I do like adaptations, and I think I also think, like, to your point, Wishbone, like, how great is it to give young students a way into a much more complex story, right? Right. And so some of the parodies, particularly the ones that are done for children, are just a really great way to give people an entrance point into something, so that when they get to Shakespeare, they're like, oh, this is familiar. I know this. I also think for people who don't like Shakespeare very much, I think it can be one of those things that, I remember when The Lord of the Rings came out, which I know isn't Shakespeare, but I'm making a point. When Lord of the Rings came out, there were people who didn't like it, and they were like, "Oh, that's just D&D," and it's like, no, D&D got all that from this, right? So sometimes people will see a Shakespeare and they'll be like, "Well, that's just the classic story," and it's like, yeah, this is where that classic story comes from, and in some cases, actually, there was another version of that story, and this is just the version that got through is the Shakespeare version. But I think it also suffers from that sometimes too, is people are like, there's a great thing, Stephen Moffat, so bringing up one of our favorite Doctor Who showrunners, when he was writing Sherlock, he said what was tough about writing Sherlock was writing it in a way that was different because people know it so well. And he said it's the same way that Hamlet feels like it's full of quotes. So it's hard to make Hamlet interesting because people know Hamlet so well that you can feel like it's just an actor quoting all those famous Hamlet lines. But those Hamlet lines are still really good. You just have to find a way to make those sort of new and interesting and accessible for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely what a lot of these adaptations that we're going to be talking about here to have varying degrees of success with, because a lot of them are very much that straight to screen. Here, we know exactly what we're going to present to you, and we're not even going to try and add a new perspective on it. This is just bringing it to a screen and showing you exactly what it should have been, versus others that take a big swing and are like, no, yeah, we know we're doing Hamlet. We mentioned the Lion King already, but we're going to do something so different that you're almost going to barely recognize that it is Hamlet, right? And that's like it's something worth applauding, but also it's like yeah, it also reminds people that like even your favorite thing probably had roots in Shakespeare. So and maybe that's a good segue to start talking about some of these actual adaptations. So I'll just start with a brief history for us. So, Mr. William Shakespeare, since he's not Sir, as we have established, was born and raised.
By the way,
in
really
Stratford.
quickly, I did look this up, and so currently, most like actors or artists who get knighted get an OBE, the Order of the British Empire, and I just wanted to look that up. That didn't come out to the early 1900s, so they wouldn't have been doing that during Shakespeare's time. They wouldn't have been Shakespeare's time. They mainly would have been celebrating military or government officials with a knighthood. And also they wouldn't, it's very unlikely they would have knighted someone who was poor and not part of the landed people as well. So now when you see an actor or someone who is knighted or Dame Judi Dench or whatever, they most often have an OBE, which is a Order of the British Empire, which was in the early 1900s. So that's why back then it would have been a military or government honor mostly.
Good on the...
Pretty sure that in Goldmember, that's what Austin Powers gets. He gets the OBE.
Right. There is another one that they get a little less often that I can't remember off the top of my head, but the actors that or performers that you know often have the OBE. If they're not government or military, they usually have an OBE. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Got it. No, that's good to know. And that would be why. I mean, yeah, and you're exactly right. So obviously Shakespeare, probably not very well regarded by the Queen, despite what was the movie Shakespeare in Love tried to tell us that he actually got to meet the Queen and all that, and who knows? But we'll talk about that.
I think for like a modern kind of, I was just gonna say I just think about A Knight's Tale, isn't it? Bettany's kind of supposed to be like Chaucer, and he's kind of like this guy. Like in the beginning, he doesn't look like someone who would be knighted, and is kind of like covered in dirt, and I think of thespians at the time were definitely not getting the love like actors would now.
No. And it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. I think you're right, though, for sure. I think he's stark naked. That's his introduction, right?
Mm-hmm. And that to me is I feel showing what the vibe was of how people felt about writers or actors at the time.
Yeah, for sure. So William Shakespeare was born and raised in Stratford upon Avon, which Fred said he visited in Warwickshire. And correct me if I'm getting any of these names wrong, you guys. At the age of 18, he married Anne Hathaway, not the theater kid energy Anne Hathaway, but with whom he had 3 children, Susanna, and his twins Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet, not Hamlet. So sometime between 1585 and 1592, he began a successful career as a London actor, writer, and part owner of the playing company. We had discussed Lord Chamberlain's Men in the Globe Theatre, but they were later known as the King's Men. And at age 49, he appears to have retired to Stratford, where he died 3 years after that. So it's about 1613 to 1616. As of 2004, we're jumping way ahead, the Guinness Book of World Records recognizes over 410 feature-length film and TV versions of William Shakespeare's plays, making Shakespeare the most filmed author ever in any language. And as of June 2020, the Internet Movie Database, better known as IMDb, lists Shakespeare as having writing credit on 1,500 films, including those under production but not released. The earliest known production or a screen adaptation was called King John from 1899. So, jumping into adaptations, I have a little game I would like to play with you all.
Oh dear.
Oh boy. So I went and researched the top 25 critically rated Shakespeare adaptations on Rotten Tomatoes. I want to see if maybe in just a couple guesses you can get any of the top 5. So you might have to really dig down, but maybe even stumble across one. I'll give you credit if you get just an adaptation of the play. Extra credit if you can get who directed or starred in it.
And we're talking adaptations, not just the version of the play itself.
So yeah, it would be a movie adaptation, but it can be a straight adaptation of the play. So if it was well regarded enough, they might have given it a 99% or something on Rotten Tomatoes.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I'm just going to see, just because everyone knows this one, Lion King, would that be on there?
The Lion King is on the list, but it comes in at number 12
Wow.
with a 94%.
Wow.
Okay.
Or tomato meter.
West Side Story? Top 5?
West Side Story also on the list at number 13 with a 92% rating, just behind the Lion
All
King.
right.
Ooh.
Is Fred in on this, or does he know the answers?
No, he doesn't.
Oh.
No, I was going to throw out a guess. I'm
Your
going
turn,
to guess some more modern. I'll go with Romeo plus Juliet.
Ooh, the Baz Luhrmann one?
Oh, yeah.
That comes in at number 25 on the head.
Oh, jeez.
73% tomato meter.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna guess the Kenneth Branagh Hamlet film.
Ooh, just missed the top 5. That one is number 10.
Oh,
The 95%. You're getting warmer though with that kind of guess.
So now I'm just thinking of other
Henry V, the Kenneth Branagh.
Yes, number 2, 98% rating.
Which one?
Henry V.
Henry V.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I know other ones, but I'm sure. I don't think 10 Things I Hate About You would make the top critics list. It's a very classic Shakespeare adaptation, but I don't think it's going to make the top IMDb.
Yeah, just missed the top 25. It was below William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet.
I'm going to say the same thing about She's the Man, the 12th Night adaptation starring Amanda Bynes. I think that also exists, but is not on the list you're talking about. Is there a Macbeth in there? Maybe the Ian McKellen Macbeth is on there with young Dame Judi Dench.
I'm going to guess Ian McKellen King Lear.
Okay. We have 2 Ian McKellen ones out there. What are they?
Okay. So the Ian McKellen, you said Macbeth. I'm trying to see if it's on the list here.
It's old, and it's possible that that might not even qualify because I think it's a filmed version, but it's almost just a film version of the play, so might not be on there.
Yeah, I am not seeing that one. And then the other one was King Lear with him.
I was also thinking the Taming of the Shrew movie.
Yeah.
What about the Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor Taming of the Shrew?
The Taming of the Shrew, that one is on the list.
The Kenneth Branagh one.
But that one is number 22.
I was thinking Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton.
Yeah, the Burton and Elizabeth Taylor one is number 22. The Ian McKellen King Lear is not on the top 25.
Is the Anthony Hopkins King Lear on the top 25? That's much more recent. That's Emma Thompson and Francis Pugh.
I do not see it. No.
Redmond. That's a shame. That's a good one.
Which, listen.
I'll throw in Titus if we're talking Tony.
That one also did not make it.
Okay.
Oh, I'm
Do we
sorry.
have another on the
I'm
list?
sorry.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. I have an amendment. The Anthony Hopkins King Lear is on the list. Number 17.
Yeah, it's good. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yep.
Laurence Olivier, Hamlet.
Now we're cooking here.
That's what I was saying when you interrupted me with your update, but that's fine.
That is number 8. So we still only have one of the top 5 on here. I'll give you guys a couple more guesses and then I'll tell you.
I'm really hoping the Laurence Olivier Othello isn't on the list because that's deeply problematic.
Yeah. No.
What about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead?
Yeah, it's a good one.
That one is not on the list. Not on the top 25.
I would like to speak.
Should be number 1.
Yeah.
All right. Fuck it. What about the Northman?
I don't know that the Northman was on the list of the top 25. Let me see where it would have fallen, though, Fred.
It would be on my list.
If the Northman had counted among this list, it would have fallen around the 1920 mark.
Yeah. What about the Trevor Nunn? I would say Othello, the Trevor Nunn version. That also has Ian McKellen in it.
What about Othello?
I don't see any Othello on this list.
This list is nuts, and I'm getting angry.
Not even just O with Mekhi Phifer?
No, that was not that good.
What about the Romeo and Juliet from the 60s? Where they got in trouble with the nudity. Is that one on there?
It is on there. That one is the number 11.
Oh.
Yep. Directed by Franco Zeffirelli.
Oh, I know what's on there. Mel Gibson as Hamlet. Yep.
I don't think his made the list. I don't think.
What about Ethan Hawke's Hamlet? I'm just naming at this point. I'm sorry, guys.
No.
Oh, Shakespeare in Love. Does Shakespeare in Love count?
Oh God,
I did not see Shakespeare in Love because I think these are strictly Shakespeare adaptations, and that's
okay. I wasn't sure.
Shakespeare.
I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I'll give you each one more guess, and then I will tell you what the top 5 are.
It is The Much Ado About Nothing with Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson as Beatrice and Benedict in there.
It is on the list at number 18.
Hudge.
What about Macbeth with Star Trek dude?
Star Trek dude.
I can't think of his name right now.
Patrick Stewart.
Patrick Stewart.
Not seeing that one.
Okay. All right.
Nope.
Oh, The Midsummer Night's Dream with Stanley Tucci and Michelle Pfeiffer?
No, not on the list.
God, I don't like this list.
All right, Fred, you get one more guess to hit something.
I remember that Patrick Stewart Macbeth was on Netflix for a long time, and it's just him like staring you right in the face. Like I just remember every time when I would scroll through Netflix, I would just have to say Macbeth.
Wonderful.
I'm just going to ask, is there a Julius Caesar at all on the list? There's been...
Oh, sure.
There sure is a Julius
Marlon Brando.
Caesar. Yep, it is the Brando.
1953.
Number 7.
Yeah.
Directed by Mank. Joseph L. Mankiewicz.
Is either Pacino's Richard III or Merchant of Venice on the list?
It is not. Neither of those are. I do want to talk about Looking for Richard because I didn't realize that Al Pacino made that documentary.
Yeah, absolutely. And my teacher from the Globe is in it.
What? Oh my gosh.
Oh, nice.
His name was also Patrick.
Oh, that's right.
I had the Merchant of Venice Pacino version.
I've seen that as well. That's good.
That's not on the list, unfortunately. But
all right, what's on this dang list?
Okay, number 1 is Henry V with Laurence Olivier.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Number 3, this one's gonna really rock your noggin. Forbidden Planet, which is
I was gonna guess that one. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which is an adaptation of The Tempest. Directed by Fred Wilcox and starring Leslie Nielsen. Speaking of Naked Gun.
Wow.
Yep.
Full
Yep.
circle.
The first true sci-fi films, Forbidden Planet is a fantastic movie. There's literally monsters of the id attacking. That's fantastic.
Oh my
See if you
gosh.
I'm so mad that you said it before I did, because I was like, oh, Forbidden Planet is a Shakespeare one, and then I forgot to say it. I had to present on Forbidden Planet for another show one time, so I learned a lot about Forbidden Planet. Yeah.
I really want to watch it now because it sounds amazing.
It's great. It's really good. It holds up. And Leslie Nielsen when he was a serious actor.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I just remember hearing that's where he's like just straight up acting in that. He's not playing a goofball.
Yeah, he was a serious actor for a long time, and that's why the brothers picked him, because the thing is, he doesn't change his delivery of a line in Naked Gun or Police Squad from how he did it in a straight movie, and that's why it works, because he's not telling a joke. He's taking himself 100% seriously.
That also works the opposite way. I just heard a interview regarding, like, with Breaking Bad taking on Bryan Cranston. Like, comedians are able to, dig into that deepness and that seriousness as well. So it's fun to see the reversals happen as well.
Yeah, you get to see them emote in a way that maybe a dramatic actor doesn't think about, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Number 4 is Chimes at Midnight, which is an adaptation of Henry IV, directed and starring Orson Welles in 1965.
I was going to say, is there an Orson Welles in there somewhere?
I think, though, it's more commonly known, though, as Falstaff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because it was interesting. I tried looking up the movie, and I typed in Chimes at Midnight, and then it came up as Falstaff. So... Yeah.
I love Orson Welles' work, and I find his Shakespeare adaptations to be dull. I'll just say it. I just find them I love Kane, and I know he's just in it, but the third man is the movie. The Muppet movie is a fantastic work. You're right, but I find his radio versions of Shakespeare are very good. But I find his film versions to be dull. Anyway, sorry.
Fair criticism. Yep. Number 5 was also very close to number 6, and they're actually worth mentioning in the same breath because they are directed by the same director. One of them is Ran, which is an adaptation of King Lear, directed by Akira Kurosawa.
Oh, wow.
And number 6 is Throne of Blood, which is an adaptation of Macbeth, also directed by Kurosawa.
Nice. Okay.
Sounds good.
They sound interesting, right? Just because...
Oh, I remember it.
Yeah, I mean, just to see a Japanese director's take on Shakespeare kind of put into maybe something more imperial at that time, right? So, and it stars a lot of his classic cast members like Tatsuya Nakadai and Toshiro Mifune. So definitely, we're all over the board here, right? And I think the reason I wanted to do this little test at first, I think it was a good way for us to start throwing a lot of these adaptations out into the ether, so we can start picking up them one by one and being like, wow, look at how far we've gone. We've gone from Laurence Olivier back in 1946 to, Anthony Hopkins back in 2018, or Ian McKellen back in 1994, and then you have Kenneth Branagh, who owned the early 90s, late 80s with all of his adaptations, right? So you have a lot of people who have this steeped experience with these screen adaptations, and it's just and there's so many different ones that we see too. Between, you have Ran, which is a Japanese interpretation of it, and you have The Lion King, which is an animated interpretation musical. It's a wonder that we've seen so many different takes. I don't know if any of you guys have any that you really want to speak to specifically that kind of came up.
I will say, when I first saw Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, I thought that was just such a clever way of taking a story that, at this point, this is the only Shakespeare show that I really, really dissected from college. And to see just let's just play with this. Let's have this from somebody else's point of view. And then obviously the comedy helped too. That was the first kind of spin-off, adaptation, parody, whatever you want to call it, that really stuck out for me.
That's great. And who? I'm trying to look up who directed the movie. Because are you speaking more about the actual like adaptation first, or are you talking about like an actual movie adaptation of
Well,
it?
the movie itself was great, but just the idea of it, I just remember it clicking. Yes, the acting was great and the cinematography, all that stuff. But the idea of taking a story and looking at it from a different point of view, I just was like, this is really interesting. So, Tom Stoppard wrote it. I'm not sure who directed.
Looks like he directed it too.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well done. Yeah.
Is that like Tim Roth and Gary Oldman?
Yes.
What?
Yep.
Yeah, oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
The other brilliant thing about it was they spoke into contemporary language, and then they inserted moments of like the actual Shakespearean writing in the play in the story itself as well, which I thought, that must have been so fun to write.
Right.
Loved it.
So I'm actually not super familiar with the story itself. I only know that it's some kind of spin on Hamlet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the conceit? Is it just sort of a different perspective in the story?
It's what's going on during the play when Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are not in the play. What's going on between those two characters? So you follow them instead of anyone else.
Wow.
It's kind of like Lion King 1.5.
And that yep, absolutely. So
My God.
Wait, literally?
Because each of the Lion Kings is each of the Lion Kings is a Shakespeare adaptation.
Yes, it is.
The first one's King Lear, 1.5 is Rosencrantz.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy. I had no idea. So is the Lion King 1.5? Is that just following Timon and Pumbaa like the whole time?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Very smart.
I've never seen either the Lion King sequels or half sequels.
I will say Lion King 1.5 is not as good as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead.
I think that's fair.
In my humble and personal opinion.
But I give them the respect for trying and following just the style of Lion King is Hamlet. How about we make the sequel Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? Like, I just thought that was really fun.
That is a wonderful thing that they did.
And then Lion King 2 is Romeo and Juliet.
Yes.
Oh, is that about Simba's son or something like that? Or
His daughter, Kiara, and Narabi's, I think it's like his sister's kid, something like that.
Her sister's kid?
Yeah, because I think it's some familiar thing. Well, we'll cover it on the pod. Don't worry.
All right.
And Lion King 4 is Titus Andronicus, which I think was a mistake. To be fair. It works with lions to be eating each other. I thought that was a bold choice on Disney's part.
My goodness.
Oh my God.
Let's talk a little about the Lion King though itself, right? Because I think that's easily one of the stories, probably one of the earlier stories that a kid will probably stumble into Shakespeare, right? But it's presented in a way that doesn't really resemble Shakespeare at all, unless you're looking for the story beats. And it's just, I don't know. I think that's when, Disney was kind of clicking on all cylinders with their animation studio, with all apologies to Frozen and whatever else is coming out recently. But you certainly see, I think exactly what we're talking about is like there's sort of an irreverence for that play that comes to life on the screen, but just looks something like completely unique to anyone who would not be aware, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great thing to tell my students to make that connection right off the bat when they're introduced to Shakespeare. It's one of the first things I introduce to them is if you've seen Lion King, you've seen Hamlet. And for them to see that in the real world and make that connection right off the bat, they're interested. They're like, oh, this is something that's out there. This is not something brand new to me. So they take a little bit of that ownership, which I think is important for a student to care about something where there's a little bit of, oh, I know this, at least to a certain extent.
Right. It's kind of their gateway, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's important. I think kids definitely need that to be like, oh, I can care about this because, and it's kind of going back to the Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons conversation. I think some people probably found that gateway to Lord of the Rings by probably through a love of Dungeons and Dragons. So it's like something more, I guess, modern in air quotes, but
Yeah.
I was just going to add, and that's probably why they were able to get certain people to do it, like Jeremy Irons. I'm sure he relished the idea that he was going to be doing some version of King Lear or Hamlet. King Lear.
for sure.
No, it's Hamlet.
Hamlet. Yeah.
Hamlet.
Yeah.
King
We got
Lear's
it.
kind of
We
like
got it.
Succession. That's what I learned today when I was reading the summary.
Okay.
Patrick's, Patrick knows I haven't
yeah.
watched any of Succession yet, and he's like chomping at
Yep.
the bit for me to start.
It's so good.
Only bits and
It's
pieces.
so good. Have you seen Empire?
Yeah.
Okay, well, kind of same here. I mean, I've seen all of Succession, but yeah, well, Empire is also King Lear.
That's very interesting. I never made the connection. Although I'm not super familiar with King Lear myself.
And they actually reference it in the very first episode.
Empire was a good time in television for a while.
Yeah.
Empire was the one with Terrence.
Yeah.
What's his last name?
Howard,
Yeah, Terrence Howard, right?
and and Treasure B. Henderson, and yeah.
Oh yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. So I'm not super familiar with King Lear though. So what? A great chance to talk a little about that too, and maybe any adaptations that you like with King Lear. What is the conceit of King Lear?
I mean, in a nutshell, it's a king who is retiring and giving away. He's got to give away his land and his title and his power, pretty much. And he's got his 3 daughters, and he's got to choose which one he's going to. Ideally, he's going to divide it equally, but he plays this little game with them of they have to tell them how much they love him, and whoever expresses their love the most will get the best quality land. And so the first 2 evil sisters go, the first 2 evil daughters, I guess, go first, and they just plaster a smile on their face and tell him what he needs to hear. And then Cordelia, his favorite daughter, the youngest, refuses to pretty much play the game. She's like, I love you as much as I can. I don't know how to, I don't know. I don't know what you want from me. I love you. Like, there's nothing more than the love I have for you. And he gets all pissed and disowns her and slowly goes mad due to the fact that his other 2 daughters treat him like absolute garbage, and ends up living out in nature and realizes what it means to be a human being or just a man. Without clothing, without protection, without power, without nobility, without So he kind of learns that lesson of what it means to just the simpleness of what it is to be a man.
Wow. So it really is Succession, yeah.
Yeah.
It really sounds like the 2 daughters aren't serious people, and that's the problem.
No. So Beth and I and a group of us went and saw a show, Gods of Spies. Is that what it was, Beth?
God's Spies.
God's Spies. And so it's a show about Shakespeare writing. He's trapped in an inn due to the disease going around, and so they're quarantined pretty much in an inn, and he ends up writing King Lear in this inn. And one of the people in the show, one of the characters, stresses how important a backstory is for characters. And this Shakespeare, this character of Shakespeare in the show is like, backstory. No one cares about the backstory. They want to know what's happening now. What's happening now? And so eventually she's like, no, the backstory is very important. Like, how's this for a backstory? King Lear treated his wife like absolute crap and beat her. And the 2 older daughters know about this, and the younger daughter was never informed of this. And this is why the 2 daughters hate King Lear. And then the mother dies, and poor Cordelia, the youngest daughter, she just never knew, and she never understood, why are you so mean to Dad? I mean, he's this great person. How do you? So I was like, dang, that is a twist right there.
Wow.
However, the story itself does not work if you don't play Lear as a loved character from the get-go. In my opinion, it doesn't work. You have Kent, who is the loyal servant, and Kent is just the pure nice person of the show. And he loves Lear. And if this person loves this man who is an awful person, it kind of takes away everything that Kent represents, as well as the fool, his jester, kind of the same story there. So it wouldn't make sense if he was this kind of a jerk character and he's got all these people around him that love him, with the exception of his two awful daughters.
Very interesting. And yeah, I think and again, not to beat the Succession, comparison into the ground, but it's just so interesting because I've only seen two seasons of that show, but yeah, Logan Roy is not a love person. Everybody thinks that they love him, so it's such an interesting way to think about that and be like, maybe that's why they really just leaned in on, like, here are some really shitty rich people like all around from top to bottom.
Yeah,
and there's other themes. There's ambition, greed. Then all of Shakespeare's main characters have the tragic flaw, right? Whether it's jealousy or self-doubt or whatever it might be, and there's lots that you could say for Lear, but the fact that he needs adoration could be certainly something that you look at, and that's something that happens. There's a sort of mirror story within the story of the Gloucester character and his two sons, and what's happening there, and what we choose to believe because of the way that we're stories are told to us and things like that. So, there's deeper themes in it. It's also interesting because something that people sort of, I think, don't necessarily think about right away is that. So Shakespeare was a working actor and writer, and was writing for a sort of a repertory of actors that he worked with regularly. So there are scenes in Shakespeare, for example, that are very difficult to perform, and he deliberately gave those to one of his actors who had a slight speech impediment, just to make that actor say this like slightly difficult speech to give, because he's working with the same actors over and over again, right? So he's having fun with them in a lot of ways. And sort of the thing that they say about Shakespeare stuff is that a young, in this case, male actor, but a young actor, when an actor's young, they play Hamlet. When they're in the middle of their career, they play Macbeth. And when they're coming to the end of their career, that's when they play King Lear. And that's, so I don't know what that means for me, but, uh-oh. So there's something about that too, is that if you think of Lear in the context of the other Shakespearean male main protagonists, there's something about that as well too. It was about at this point, what is this character looking for, and it's sort of unending adoration, and he has to get past that part. So it's an interesting viewpoint of a very different type of character than Hamlet or Romeo might be.
Yeah.
So even younger actors could have played Romeo and then Hamlet and then like that, but it's those main four ones. Yeah.
Something else I noticed between the two parent roles is the danger of favoritism, and what can happen to those other sons or daughters of yours that don't feel as loved, and the consequences that can come from that. It's one thing both the A plot and B plot kind of share.
That just speaks to, we talk about how these plays last a long time. It's because these things are still things we think about. I think in our own families is like how we treat our siblings, how we treat our parents, and how our parents treat us. And I think, when you said that, it really knocked the nails on the head for me about why King Lear is probably still around and still being kind of used in television and movies, because it's family dynamics, and we're always going to have those in some way.
Right. Yeah. And that was going to pretty much echo what I was saying too, is like you see so many similar themes, not just in, a lot of modern adaptations, but in some of these other shows as well. And just the feeling of like that somebody's owed something too. And I think that's what's an interesting thing I want to explore about it. I think with even Macbeth, because we talked, you were saying like kind of middle of your career, you play Macbeth. I feel like it kind of completes this circle we've started here, because I think a lot about like this recent adaptation that I think it was Joel Cohen? Correct me on that, Fred. I know you know.
Yeah, I
Was
think
it
it
him
was
who did the
Joel.
tragedy of Macbeth?
I believe so.
Yeah, with Denzel and Frances McDormand. And it was such an interesting thing to watch that, where they put the movie in black and white and they really force you to focus on who these characters are and like what their motivations are. And I feel like I've seen so many different versions of that story. And for some reason, it was like that was the first time I felt like I kind of like really latched onto sort of like, I kind of feel bad for Macbeth, because I always kind of thought like, oh, you know, what an asshole. Like, you know, he's just an asshole from top to bottom. Like, he thinks he's owed this because somebody told him he's going to be a king, right? Like, but it just sort of feels like, man, it's like he's just sort of looking for a meaning in some way. And
Yeah, one of the movies I watched for this podcast episode, I watched Men of Respect, which was the John Turturro take on Macbeth that's modern day. Well, it came out in the 90s, and it's kind of like a gangster film. And I just thought it was very interesting that they could kind of filter a lot of the stuff that I saw in the Cohen one with the dynamics between the husband and wife, and see it in a new light and see it in a way that I've seen in other shows. It made me think a lot, not just because it was gangster related. I want to bring up our past episode on Sopranos. There is so much of the Hamlet in Sopranos when I was watching this adaptation, the paranoia of the people who are quote unquote loyal to you, and whether or not they're loyal to you or whether they're planning against you.
mm-hmm.
And just kind of that mania and fear, like, are these people laughing behind my back? This adaptation, it wasn't like the best movie, but it did a really good job of taking this kind of mobster world and those problems and the Macbeth story and combining them in a way. And at that moment in the film, I was like, this is working. This is kind of like a timeless feeling. That was a very cool feeling to see that and see it in a way I hadn't seen it.
No, I think it's definitely an interesting thing to think about, because, yeah, obviously been watching The Sopranos recently, too, since our episode. And, yeah, you do kind of get those vibes with Tony, sort of like, yeah, you definitely see the paranoia with him and just how, I mean, and then it comes to fruition where he's paranoid. And then when he's right, it's like then he's so justified in taking action against somebody like Big Pussy in season 2. Spoiler alert. But, you know, it's just these interesting things, and it just haunts him too. It's sort of like the hauntings that, you know, you even say like Lady Macbeth sees when she sees the spot in her hand, right? It's like constantly like she thinks it's like she can't get the spot out, right? And like it just kind of makes me think of, yeah, I'm glad you made that comparison, because now it's making me think of that whole story in a totally different light.
Yeah, and I will say Big Pussy is in Men of Respect for a couple of scenes.
There's the connection again. I don't know. Are there other Macbeth adaptations that you guys have thought about that you really enjoy, or anything different about it?
I like that fairly recent one where the three sisters is played by one woman.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's black and white.
That is the tragedy of Macbeth. Yep.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yep. I like that concept of one woman who just pretty much just has those three voices in her head constantly, and she's the only one saying them. I thought that was an interesting take. That was something different that I'd never seen before.
There's so much familiar about that movie with the story of Macbeth, but yet it did feel unique. And maybe it was just the choice to put it in black and white. I don't know. And it was also during the pandemic too. So I feel like it was just like,
yeah,
or like the heat of the pandemic, and I was sort of feeling shut in. I'm like, I'm watching this very like dark movie.
Yeah, I will say I watched that during pandemic and it felt like a fever dream, but I do remember the scene with the one witch, because I think it's Mrs. Fig from the Harry Potter movies, and she comes in and just shoots threes the whole movie, and like that's the part that stayed with me for that movie. Like, she is fantastic.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I am very curious about the Kurosawa take on both King Lear and Macbeth, because again, like I said, you know, I've seen Seven Samurai and I've seen Yojimbo, and it's so interesting to have him almost do a reverse, because both of those movies were adapted into popular westerns in Magnificent Seven and I think it was A Fistful of Dollars, and it's just an interesting idea that he kind of went back the other way. It's like, well, fine, if you guys are going to turn all my very samurai focused movies into these spaghetti westerns, then I'm going to go back. I'm going to turn Shakespeare into a classic Japanese story. And I wish I had a time to explore that, but I was just very, very fascinated, especially with how highly regarded both of those movies are.
Yeah.
But lest we ignore a popular story that most people are familiar with, and I know we brought it up a couple of times on here, is when Romeo and Juliet. And I know we mentioned, I think Beth brought up West Side Story, but you didn't say which West Side Story, Beth. Which one were you talking about?
Oh yeah, I mean they're both it. I will say I have not seen the more recent West Side Story. My understanding is the more recent West Side Story is excellent. I just haven't had a chance to see it. But yeah, so I guess I was talking about the older one is the other one where the older one was the other one where I was watching it more because at the time I was a kid who was doing musicals, and so I had friends who were really into musicals, even though I myself am not as into musicals as some people are. I don't have a problem with them. They're a perfectly legitimate form of entertainment. But I am probably more likely to see a play than a musical if I have, a single night and just enough money for one ticket. So we watched West Side Story, and then at the end they asked, I thought it's like, oh, it's all right. It's kind of familiar. And then one of the people was like, well, yeah, it's Romeo and Juliet. And I was like, oh, yeah, it is, isn't it? Oh, damn. Here I am trying to be so smart about the Shakespeare and everything else. And then I was like, oh, that's right. That's what that was. Of course so. And then it's one of those things where if you go back and watch it with that lens, you're like, oh, what a clever and interesting way to reframe it. Because adaptations are great. Not every adaptation of everything is successful. Sometimes people make a choice to try to make a choice that's different than other choices that others have made. And then you go, this is why they don't do this with this.
Yeah.
Like, this is why this isn't set to this kind of music generally, or this is why you don't decide that this character is a villain, because then it doesn't work if they're the villain and this character is the hero or something like that. But yeah, so it's a very successful and interesting way to reframe it, I think.
Yeah. And it's definitely, I mean, it definitely adds something more. And I think the reason I like the recent movie a little bit more is because, I mean, while the first movie obviously was the first one to do it, I think they got the representation a little bit better this time. Maybe not casting Natalie Wood as a Puerto Rican woman.
Absolutely. And like I said, we've already talked about the fact that,
Othello.
Yes, exactly. So obviously it makes great strides in terms of actually representing the characters a lot better as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just haven't had a chance to see it yet. It was one of those movies that that seemed like a good movie to see at a theater, that came out at a time when I wasn't seeing movies in the theater yet. Again, after in terms of pandemic times, and then
sure,
I'm slightly disinclined to watch a musical on my 13-inch computer screen. Musicals are spectacle, right? So watching it in my tiny unseeable screen is it's just a little less interesting to me than if it was like, oh, you can actually go see this live version or something.
And it's definitely just hard to beat that 60s one for sure.
Right.
I mean, yeah, the 60s one has problems, but it's flipping West Side Story.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my guy Steve shot the hell out of the new one, but I do love the old.
Yeah,
for sure. I mean, yeah, you can look beyond, I think, a couple of the things that might have been a little more problematic about it now to recognize, what a great story it is, or what a well-filmed movie it is. And I mean, obviously, you get Rita Moreno in both those movies too. She reprises, well, I didn't reprise the same role, obviously, but interesting that, that role itself was an Oscar winner in both versions, which is, I think, says something to this story that this was an adaptation of a play that was adapted from another play, but also the fact that the characters are so rich and everything is so well put together about it that it's just been nominated to the T up and down the board both times it got made. It's like Star is Born. Is that a Shakespeare adaptation? No, it's not.
I mean, everything is really,
Yeah.
if you look for it.
I mean, there's a reason that the word Shakespearean exists, right? The themes are so classic.
Yeah, and but I think that's what's so interesting too, is because I think you do see a lot of people who are like, "Oh, that's so Shakespearean," but yeah, and then it's almost like I think the reason I wanted to bring up Romeo and Juliet is because that story is so often referenced. Anytime it is like, "Oh, here's one side, you have X person from this clan or X or Y person from that clan, and they come together with this forbidden romance." Like you almost can't speak about a forbidden romance without making some kind of comparison to Romeo and Juliet, where it's just been done over and over again. That it really is something when something does rise up to the ether. And I wouldn't say that, that's necessarily the play that defines Shakespeare, but I would imagine if you paneled 25 people on the street, you're probably going to get that one more often than the rest, right?
Definitely.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason we started with that one with the kind of sort of, because Hamlet was written, but we're like, I think Romeo and Juliet might be a better one to start this with, because it was something new that we were trying on the old Schmitz and Giggles docket. But
yeah.
And it was a worry going forward, going with, I mean, Hamlet, yes, everyone knows to be or not to be, but not every person could sit down and give you 2 or 3 sentences of what the story is about, unless they, of course, mention the Lion King. And then past that, it's, your average person's like, maybe Julius Caesar, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, there's, So it's one of the greatest things, though, about writing these too, is when people come in and they say, I knew nothing about Othello, and I was able to follow that story exactly, like the whole time. I was never lost. So I think when you do an adaptation, you got to be careful of making it to, well, even like sketch writing, if you start talking about, Back to the Future, if you get too deep in Back to the Future references, you're going to lose some of your audience, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I think that's, just another thing to keep in mind.
Right. Like if you mention a DeLorean, like everyone goes, aha, I got it. But yeah, you talk about, I don't even know, like
Mr. Peabody's pine trees.
Yeah. Like Twin Pines Mall.
Yeah.
It's like, like obviously you're going to lose people in a hurry.
Well, I think also a good parody has to stand on its own as a good story as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's why I've said this often, like one of my favorite action movies is Hot Fuzz, and my absolute favorite zombie movie is Shaun of the Dead, because they are both incredibly entertaining and engaging and fun and well written and well acted stories on their own, beyond the fact that they're also very hilarious, accurate parodies, right?
Yeah.
I don't really like zombie stuff that much. But Shaun of the Dead is a fantastic film that's, yes, it gets to the heart of what can be funny or silly about zombie movies, but it also has a lot of pathos, and it also, you care about what's happening to the characters. And so I think certainly something that we strive for, and then I think Patrick really achieves very well, and the cast that come together, is the story that we're telling is also itself an interesting story to tell, like the changes that we're making to it and that sort of thing. So I think that's important too, right? Because you're going to have people who are like, oh, I'm such a huge fan of this, it was so fun to watch you sort of have fun with it. And then you're going to have people who are, I'm not a huge fan of Shakespeare, and I just thought what you were doing was fun. Same thing happened when we did Dracula. But yeah, like Shaun of the Dead, there's people who love zombie movies who are like, that's one of my favorite ones. And there's people like me who just don't find zombie movies all that interesting. And it's like, this is actually a really good one as the genre goes. Like I've seen plenty. It's just, that's the best one in my opinion.
Sure. Now with the adaptations or the parodies that you guys are writing for Schmitz and Giggles, is it like a Romeo and Juliet or I'm talking about the Baz Luhrmann one now, where it's like, you'll set it in a different time but it's still using the same dialogue? Or is it, nope, we're going to update the dialogue too and also use modern day? Or no, it's like, we're in that time, we're using some of the dialogue, but we're also using some kind of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, trying to modernize it for people.
I mean, the way I have been doing it, and this may change. It almost did change with Dracula. Is try to stay as true to the original story as possible.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've seen the Family Guy Star Wars parodies.
I have. Yes.
Okay, so as far as style goes, I would say that is probably the most best comparison, just because it's still Star Wars. It's just Seth MacFarlane throwing in bits and heightening ideas and making a character a certain way that, it's like, oh yeah, that was true. But okay, Seth MacFarlane just really pointed that out. So that style of like, oh, he was very true. I mean, he even had the music in there. He worked with George Lucas on that. And obviously you really cared about Star Wars as the stories and the characters. So yeah, it is the story. I mean, if you go, you will learn the story of these Shakespeare stories, but it is definitely, I'd say 90 to 95% contemporary language with some of the more classical lines, the classical lines sprinkled in.
Got it.
I think that's the best way to do it if you're adapting.
I mean, that's what I would want to see. I guess that's kind of another rule with writing comedy. It's like, well, if I wouldn't find this funny, or if I walked in and didn't know the story of Othello, would I still be entertained by this? And
Right.
Yeah, when I was in high school, we did West Side Story, and it was nice. The theater director, he inserted dialogue pieces from Romeo and Juliet throughout the play. And I thought that was just a really nice touch because it highlighted the language of Shakespeare, but everyone was able to kind of keep up with the story because either it was in the form of West Side Story or they were just familiar with West Side Story. But having a scene end on like just a piece of that dialogue or just incorporating anyway, I think that's a great way to get people more familiar with it. And it just kind of shows like, oh, this is an adaptation of something else and it comes from somewhere else. I think that's great.
yeah.
Yeah. And I was even going to say to that effect then, Fred, too, that with West Side Story, I think there's one reason why that adaptation, I think, maybe resonates with more people than something like Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, because it obviously it takes, not only adapts a story that they're familiar with and they're kind of following a lot of those similar beats, but it's told in a way that like, you understand. You're not having to try and translate Shakespeare. But I think that's what's so jarring. I think why some people really love the style of that Luhrmann one, where it's like, oh gosh, look at, they're all dressed like modern day. It's 1996, but they're also talking like Shakespeare. It's Shakespeare dialect. It's sort of like, okay, so I see Leo pulled out a gun. All right, what's he saying?
Yeah, they're driving cars. As I was watching in the theater, I thought, I wonder if they would have like No Fear Shakespeare'd that and just translated it to a T in modern day language. I wonder if it would have got bashed for that. I mean, obviously you're going to lose the beauty of the language, but yeah, that was tough for me as a freshly out of high school watching that going, oh, okay, I'm not going to be able to follow this.
Yeah. It's a unique watch now, but it's definitely a, I don't know. It's an acquired taste. You have to really like the style, I think, of what they're trying to do with it. And maybe that's a great segue here, everyone, to jump into our coulda, woulda, shoulda segment and start inventing some new ideas for adaptations that you have never seen before, whether they are for a parody show or perhaps for a movie that you've never seen. And I guess, yeah, that's the question I have for you is what is something that you would have liked to seen, or maybe would have liked to seen different about an adaptation like Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet? Would you have wanted to see that with modern dialect versus the actual like written lines from the play?
Ooh, I feel like I'm going to say something and then I'll be like, oh no, that's the thing. They already did that. That was so because a lot of it has been done. I remember thinking Hamlet as a one-man show would be interesting. Like all of it's in his head. And of course, well, yeah, that's been done. I'm like, okay, never mind.
That has been done? Who did that?
It's their stage adaptations of it. I don't know who's done it. I've never seen it, but people have called me out on it being done. So
not a lot of sci-fi adaptations of Shakespeare that I know of.
Hamlet on Mars.
Yeah, let's put him in space.
I mean, outside of Forbidden Planet, which we talked about a little bit already.
Forbidden Planet would be one, yeah.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see some of the histories done. Although it does sound, just from what I've heard about Secession, it sounds like maybe there's some of those in there, but I think the histories can get a bad rap because they're the ones that people don't tend to know as much unless they are Shakespeare fans.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they are steeped in British history, and so for an American audience, there's not an immediate entry point there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to see some of the, because those have amazing, obviously, writing in them and scenes and character choices and that kind of stuff, and it would be interested to see those turn in. I know that there are some limited series shows and those kind of things that have been Shakespearean in that, but again, I what's interesting about those is I think like the political intrigue ones tend to be Shakespeare's tragedies and not his histories, and I just think it'd be interested to see some of the histories done, just because they don't get as much play.
Mm-hmm.
The comedies, the tragedies, and the philosophies tend to get much more. So
yeah, and it would be interesting to see something like that. And I mean there's so many adaptations. Obviously we haven't gotten enough love for a lot of the things, but I think one of the things I enjoy about a movie like 10 Things I Hate About You is it takes something that is a little more official, where it's involving lords or or something like that, and it's like, no, let's just put this in a high school setting and let's see them do it. I mean, and I think the brilliance of that story and why people love it so much is one that the cast is so charming, like from top to bottom, really. I mean, you have even just like a lot of people who were sort of entering the public sphere, I think, for the first time with like Heath Ledger, and they're like, oh my gosh, what a charming person he is. But like to try and maybe take something like that, where maybe it's not necessarily the historical drama in the same way of Napoleon that's going to have Joaquin Phoenix and doing Julius Caesar, but what if you did that with like, something similar to Succession, where it's like a corporate CEO of somebody who is slowly kind of taking over like all these different like media conglomerates, which is a great commentary on what's happening with Disney right now, right? Like they're literally just eating up all these other companies. And you could do something like that where maybe it is like, it's almost kind of like The Social Network I'm even thinking about.
I am always interested when they do a modern retelling of anything. The Jesus Christ Superstar, when they come out with like machine guns and like vans, I get excited for some reason. I love just taking something that is like kind of so old and modernizing it, but keeping the language the same. I think that like I really liked. I couldn't tell you anything about it, but I remember really enjoying the Coriolanus updated version with like Gerard Butler and was it Ralph Fiennes?
Yeah.
I just think it's kind of cool to see Shakespeare, but with like I don't know, like a modern view. I think that just brings people in and also just kind of makes it feel fresh at the same time.
Definitely. Like I and we brought up She's the Man before too, but I just kind of love the idea of like, let's just throw some very interesting actors in a totally kind of dumb story that covers something though that really has such a rich text, like like a Hamlet, where we do see that kind of come into a modern scope. I mean, obviously that has a tragic end, but I don't know,
Yeah. Have the Muppets haven't done any sort of like full on Shakespeare adaptations, have they?
I don't think so. What would you pitch for one? Like, what do you think would serve the Muppets well? Probably a comedy of some sort, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or what they do so well is taking serious stuff and inserting their own humor into it. Like a Treasure Island or something of that sort. I don't even know if it would have to be a comedy. Matter of fact, I think they would probably do better with a drama and sprinkling in their own Muppet humor.
Well, I mean, the Muppet Show did it sometimes. Like on the Muppet Show, there was a Hamlet version.
Mm-hmm.
I know for that. So I don't think they've ever done it as like a full.
Right. Yeah. Wizard of Oz and Treasure Island. I don't know if any others are
Muppet
coming to
Christmas
mind.
Carol too. Obviously, they did
Right.
the Christmas Carol, which
But
I think what's fun about that,
Yep.
we just did an episode on the Muppets recently, so it's all very fresh. But the idea that you get like a serious actor of some sort, like let's just say you get Kate Blanchett, right, doing just some stone cold, like very serious performance, and like this, like something super, like I don't know.
Yeah, it's with Kermit as
Lady
Macbeth.
Macbeth. Yeah.
She's like I'm Tim Spot. All right, you feeling okay over there?
Would that make Fozzie like Macduff or whatever his name is?
Macduff. That would be kind of great.
Yeah. There's my
That's a good one.
Could have, should have.
Yeah.
Should be.
No, I like the idea though of doing the Muppets. I like the idea of doing the one of the histories, whether it's doing a straight adaptation of that or you do something a little more modern. I don't know, Fred, any others that you had that you were thinking of?
No, I think it's just exciting to see actors or just updating the setting or just having a modern take to it. I mean, I've been watching a lot of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I'd love to see that cast just do some sort of Shakespeare. I think there's enough talent between them as actors; they could pull something interesting off.
Yeah. I just trying to envision them doing anything like this. It almost reminds me of like the episode where they like are retelling the history of like how the Liberty Bell got its crack, and I'm just imagining them doing something like that, or just very pompous. Yeah.
And I don't have the right answer for this, but I would just throw out, I think like some sort of animated movie taking a crack out of big story like Lion King did. I feel there's got to be another Shakespeare play that is ripe to do this too. I mean, I guess they burned through 3 with 3 Lion Kings, but there's got to be something. I love the idea of just making it accessible for everyone, and just having young people have a way in. That just makes it exciting.
Sure. I would like to see the Romeo and Juliet, the Baz Luhrmann Romeo and Juliet, where it's just Leo doing Leo things, but not necessarily speaking Shakespeare. As much as I appreciate what a choice that was to do it that way, it would have been really fun to just see him, I don't know, kind of doing something like he did in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, like as like one of those characters he plays.
I'm sure you'd get like, I don't know if I would use the word better, but you would definitely get different performances if they didn't have to worry about kind of keeping that language intact. But I will say, before we move away from that Romeo and Juliet, I do like that they use the language, because that movie seems almost unworld. Like it seems from completely different from anything else I've seen. So it seems like it takes place in a place that doesn't exist. And I think that's what that movie has going for me. That doesn't look like a California I know.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we just need to see another Kenneth Branagh, him doing something completely different.
Well, I don't want him to stop making Perot movies, not Ross Perot movies.
The Agatha Christie's, yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, just don't let him stop doing those.
I will say for Kenneth Branagh, this isn't even related to a coulda, woulda, shoulda, but like something that I maybe my coulda, woulda, shoulda is I would like to see more Shakespeare adaptations out of him, because I did watch that Much Ado About Nothing version that he did from 1993, and I do appreciate how much I felt like, even in comparison to a movie maybe like Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, I know we keep coming back to that one, but he was able to express, I think, with so much of body language what people were trying to say to one another, especially in a very dialogue heavy production like Much Ado About Nothing. Like, you were never questioning exactly like, oh, what's going on right now. Like, you knew when he was torn up about it or something like that. Like, he just had such a good grasp of Benedict and just making like his like, oh, I can't believe that, she's into me or what, something like that. And it's just, I don't know. I thought I really appreciated the performances he could get out of everybody. And he did his best with Keanu Reeves.
I was going to say, I always remember that movie because I watched it in a drama class. And the whole time the drama teacher was just dunking on Keanu Reeves. And I remember even saying to him, like, I don't know, he's kind of good in The Matrix. And just like, he's like, no. And I mean, like, looking back, I mean, he showed us a lot of movies, so I don't know if he'd really had room to talk, like, we probably should have actually been performing, doing stuff, but I just remember him being so vicious to the guy.
Yeah.
That's because, I mean, that one thing that Keanu does, he does very well.
I will not put my name on a podcast that bashes Keanu Reeves. I'm just putting this on there right now.
Oh, no, we're pro. I'm talking about
American Treasure. And that's on the director to get the performance out of him. If they need to get that, like, he's in there, get it out of them. I mean, the thing about an adaptation that uses the text is that you have to get around the text. So you know what I mean? And what I don't mean like that is, I don't mean change the text. I mean, you have to use the text in the way that it was written so that it just sounds like regular speech. There's a great moment in the Anthony Hopkins Lear where I'm watching it, and there's amazing actors in there. Hopkins is in there, Florence Pugh, who I think is one of the, like, I think is the actress of our generation, perhaps, or probably not my generation, a much younger generation. But Emma Thompson is in it, and Jim Broadbent, and all that kind of stuff. And what's interesting is you're watching it, and you're sort of judging which actors make it sound like speech and which actors make it sound like someone saying Shakespeare words, right? Which there's a difference. And what's interesting is Emma Thompson goes, and you're like, that was stilted and weird and just sounded like she was, but it's when she's lying to Lear. She's such a good actress that what she does when she's lying to Lear in that scene is just say the Shakespeare words and not give them the inflections and the pauses and the weight that the certain words need and all that. She doesn't choose her verbs and all that stuff. So when she's talking, you're like, well, this isn't believable. She's just reciting something. And then the second it's her as Goneril in a real scene when Lear is visiting her house, you're like, oh, no, she's got this. It's 100%. But what's tough is the first lines that those two characters really say in the show, Goneril and Regan, are them lying. So it's difficult. You watch it and you're like, oh, these two amazing actors who are like my favorite people, like, are kind of stilted in this, and then you realize like, oh no, literally they pulled the curtain with they're supposed to not be believable. And the other actress whose name is escaping me, you can just tell she's lying, right? That's what it, but with Emma Thompson, it's not just that you can tell she's lying, it's that she performs the Shakespeare in a way where it's like, these are the Shakespeare words that I have to say and in this order, but I'm not going to give them any sort of inflection or so you don't believe her in a different way because she's that damn good. So I think that's up to, I think when you do make it an adaptation of Shakespeare, if you're going to use the language, you have to not go, oh God, this language is so hard. How can anybody possibly understand this language? You have to go like, okay, this is what they're saying. Like, what do we need to emphasize in this in the same way we'd emphasize anything else? And so somebody just needed to do that with Keanu, who's a very nice man. Yeah. And I will not have him bash him.
Oh no, we're pro for Keanu. You got to take that with Jerry Smith at Seminole High School.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't the strongest Keanu performance, but I think it does fall on Brana, whoever else, to get it out of him.
If you want good Keanu doing Shakespeare, watch My Own Private Idaho.
Yeah, I've heard good things. Never seen it. River Phoenix too, right?
Yes.
Nice. Love it. I'll have to watch that one soon. So I think that gets us then to the end of our episode, guys. Long journey here, and I know we've only barely scratched the surface because there are so many adaptations of Shakespeare. But I want to know what your top 3 Shakespeare adaptations are. And Beth, would you do us the honors of kicking us off?
Sure. If we're allowed to do ones that are just straight adaptations as well, I think the Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, Much Ado About Nothing is fantastic. I know it's gonna maybe make people roll their eyes, but I think Lion King is a fantastic movie, whether or not you realize it's Hamlet or not. And then when you do, you're like, oh, that's fantastic. That's so good. And then I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna say Forbidden Planet, because Forbidden Planet is another one of those ones that's like,
oh yeah,
You laugh, go watch Forbidden Planet and realize while you're watching it that this is the first sci-fi film that ever came out. And they knocked it out of the park. And if they had not done a good job with it, all of the history of sci-fi movies could have been very, very changed. But it is also an incredibly smart, well-done movie that is existential in a way and metaphysical in a way. And that when you realize it's The Tempest, you're like, holy crap. That's awesome. So those are my top 3.
That's wonderful.
Good pick.
No, don't apologize for Forbidden Planet. I want to watch it. It sounds
It's
awesome.
great.
No, that's
it's
going on
great.
my list.
Yeah,
So good.
for sure. Patrick, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I will go back to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Just that, again, that spin-off kind of feel. And then off of that, and I know Lion King 2, 1.5 was not a good movie, but I respected the fact that they were like, all right, we did Hamlet, now let's follow suit, and let's now do Rosencrantz and Guildenstern with the characters. So the movie itself, maybe not, but the idea of it, I thought, was like, good for them. Good for them. Instead of like just a quick cash grab and just making some kidsy kind of thing. It was like, no, let's stay true to what we're doing here. And then I because I was introduced to this one at one of my first Shakespeare shows from a great teacher in college named John McClay, was the Kenneth Branagh Hamlet. It's a masterpiece. It really is. And there's a lot of big names in it too,
And it's just like, how did they even get all these people? Yeah, it's great. Fred, would you like to go next?
Sure. I guess, so this isn't an adaptation, but I gotta throw it in. I'm not gonna do it as in my top 3, but I gotta say, like, the Shakespeare thing in like film that has stayed with me the most is probably Dead Poet Society. And there's an adaptation within the movie, and I just wanted to shout out that movie just because that one, like, I don't know, when I think Shakespeare in movies, I always think of that movie for some reason. But for my top 3, I mean, number 1 with a bullet, I gotta say Romeo Must Die.
Wow.
No, that's not it. I'm gonna do Lion King. I may have nostalgia glasses or whatever, but I do love that movie a lot. That I'm not too familiar with the source material of that, like the actual play, but the movie Lion King is big for me because that's the first movie I saw in theaters. It was a movie my dad took me to, and I lost my dad when I was 12, and I feel the big part of that movie is about losing your dad and about living in the shadow and trying to live up to something that you're probably making much bigger in your head, which I think the Lion King movie does really well. I mean, it has the whole scene where he's in the sky above him, and that scene in general is just kind of like, what's the thing in the Spider-Verse called now, where it's like the event in your life?
The canon.
Yeah, that's
event?
my canon event, is watching that scene, like when I was not when I was young, but when I was like 16, and just like, what am I doing? But then I'm gonna go 10 Things I Hate About You, and then the 60s West Side Story. That was just a VHS I had and just played constantly. And I gotta say, what's great about that one is they actually kind of committed to the tragedy of it. And a lot of these do not do that. The end of Romeo Must Die is Jet Li and Aaliyah walking away from the crime scene with their arms around each other. Like, you know, like, I think there's something to be said about committing to the tragedy of Shakespeare in those plays. So those would be my top 3. And again, another honorable mention would be The Northman. I think that's a pretty good adaptation.
That is a good one. Yeah.
I am 100% with you on the Dead Poet Society thing. When I think of Midsummer, that's my mind goes to that movie.
Yeah, which
absolutely
good link in there is in Much Ado About Nothing. Also has Robert Sean Leonard, who plays the student in Dead Poet Society, who is in that production of Midsummer Night's Dream.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So a little connection there between the two movies. Fred, I hate to say that I actually have the same top 3 as you. Exactly word for word, because they were the movies. Same thing with Lion King, probably one of the first movies I saw in theaters. I was becoming a teenager when I saw 10 Things I Hate About You. I had such a crush on Larissa Oleynik because of the show Secret World of Alex Mack that was on Nickelodeon. And when I saw she was in the movie, I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. And I just loved the cast so much. I felt like I was like, these are people I want to hang out with. Like, so it was just a very coming of age movie for me, even though it's not necessarily a coming of age story. But, I was also going to give an honorable mention to one, and it's one that's really sour just because of the person behind it. But it was the 2012 adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing, the Joss Whedon one. And I feel so bad about that because I love the cast in that movie. I love the cast in the Whedonverse in general, but obviously he is a very toxic individual, and it's really hard to love a lot of the things that he made at one point. But I try to at least lend some love to those people because they all seem like genuinely really great actors, and they don't get to do enough things because it's, I don't know, for whatever reason or another, everyone kind of puts them into that box of like, oh, you're a Whedon person. So I don't know, but yeah, just a fun one to see. So I think that gets us then to the end of our episode. But before we let you go, and thank you both, Patrick and Beth, for joining us. Is there anything? Yeah, no, we really
Thank you.
Really appreciate you coming on. Is there anything you would like to plug, though? Which I imagine there might be.
Yes, we have a show coming up at the Next Act Theater Space. It is the Comedy of King Lear, Kinda Sorta, August 10th through the 12th. Ticket information can be found at www.schmitzandgiggles.org.
Wonderful. Yeah, definitely check out schmitzandgiggles.org.
Yep, and I would also be mine, but also Optimist Theater, Shakespeare in the Park shows are happening right now. I also do some things with them. I'm not in the performances. I do some behind the scenes stuff, and they have a really cool thing of they do abridged versions, so about 90 minutes of Shakespeare in classic Shakespeare language dress, but they have a dramaturge, the fabulous M.L. Koger, who shortens them down and focuses on just sort of one element of the show or like one group of characters. They're doing Cymbeline this summer. Also part of the goal of Shakespeare in the Park is to bring Shakespeare to communities all over Milwaukee, particularly communities where there might not be access to Shakespeare as much. And also to the parks, and the shows are completely free. They're free to, the thing that we would say is they're free to see, but not free to produce. So they can always use more audience and more donations and all that kind of stuff because they do pay their actors and their crew and everyone else. But they do really, really great work for free in the park system. And then they also have Forsum Cemetery is still coming up, and then they do one on the lawn of the Marcus Center. So if you go to Optimist Theater's website, Optimist Theater is spelled R-E, and check out there or look up Shakespeare in the Park on Facebook, Shakespeare in the Park Milwaukee. And find out about it. There's multiple. They have the second half of their season is still coming. So no matter when this drops, you'll probably be able to check out a few. And chances are they're coming to somewhere near you. And I appreciate the work that they do as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, that's optimisttheater.org, as Beth said, R-E. Perfect. Mm-hmm. Definitely have to look that up. I've never been. Fred, what about you? Anything you'd like to plug?
I'll just take this time to plug Schmitz and Giggles and the King Lear show. We went to the last show, the Dracula show, and we had a blast. I know you were there too, Tom. It's really a great time. It's a good way to get familiar with material, or if you're already familiar, it's good to see a parody. It's always a great time with Schmitz and Giggles. So yeah, I'll just plug that. Yeah, go check that out.
Yeah, definitely. It should be a great show. And then I'll just plug the podcast. We appreciate you being a listener. If you'd like to rate and review us, please do so. Please give us 5 stars in your review if you really like us that much. You can always drop us a donation at buymeacoffee.com/SOTF. You can give us a one-time donation or repeat donation if you feel so inclined. And you can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at State of the Franchise Podcast with Tom and Fred. Thank you all for listening this week. Thank you once again, Patrick and Beth, for being here. And
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank
really
you.
appreciate you guys being on here and plugging the show. It was awesome talking Shakespeare adaptations. You are a fountain of knowledge. And for all you listeners, stay tuned for next time where we'll be talking about new metal. Should be a fun one.
I have equally as many thoughts on that.
please write in. Yeah.
I don't even know what that means. All right, bye.
Bye. We'll see you then.
And Tom is on the mic. I got no cares, cause all I wanna do is charge my phone and drive listening to you. And what they're talking about will always